Right, first of all, thanks very much for taking the time out today to come to the Microsoft Mothership here at TVP and go through a lot of the information we have for you. My name is Richard Cheney. I'm one of the Cloud Solution Architects, and I work in Global Partner Solutions on the Azure Core, Azure Infrastructure side of things. So I work with a lot of different partners, from service integrators, global service integrators, ISVs in different areas. We're going to talk through some of what we discuss with some of those organizations around the Cloud Adoption Framework, which is one of the key things we do in terms of onboarding new customers into Azure, and what it's going to mean for you as ISVs. And then we'll then take that a step further in terms of when you're dealing with Azure landing zones and your applications in that context. What does that mean in terms of app delivery options? What does it mean in terms of the shared services you can leverage? And where can you take that in terms of some of the tooling and functionality we have to really make your application sing on the platform? So we're going to step through this agenda. You'll see I've grayed out a couple of areas around the well-architected framework and the accelerators we have in those areas, and that's because one of my colleagues, Luke Fuss, will be covering that in the session after this. So if that's of interest, then stay on for that. Okay, so let's talk around the Cloud Adoption Framework for Azure. So this is something which the service integrators have adopted. It's an evolution of what we have with the cloud operating model from a few years back, and it's very much how we work with our largest and smallest customers, both direct and through partners, in terms of onboarding into Azure. And it's not just really a migration project or putting a new workload, it's really around transforming those organizations and how they work with the cloud. It's not the same as working with on-premise, so actually going through the strategy and the planning side does look at the digital estate and the reasons for moving different workloads into Azure, but it's very much around what they're doing in terms of organization, how they're structuring themselves, where the skills gaps are, and how they're going to bridge some of these things. And one of the key things that comes into this is really what happens once you've got past that day zero. You know, when you've got the guardrails in place for an environment to make sure policies are being followed, make sure that's being adhered to in the right way, it means that organizations can then meet their compliancy requirements. So you see a lot of the bottom around where we do deal with governance and that separation of the governance, how it's stipulated, the team that actually then makes sure it's enforced, and also how we then manage those environments, okay? And that's really key for us because when we get ready for these, when we're setting up those target environments, so we've got somewhere to migrate into, or where we've got new applications being deployed cloud natively direct into the platform, then we want to make sure that target environment is ready for that. Historically, we gave a lot of information about how that looked, and then we were asked very much by different organizations to become a bit more prescriptive about this. We won't go too much into the detail of this, don't worry. But one of the key things from that is we brought out Azure Landing Zones, an evolution of enterprise scale landing zones, which is really how do you set up these environments from the start to make sure it's ready for those workloads, okay? I will dive into a few of the areas here just to talk about some of the things that will be set up in advance for those organizations using Azure Landing Zones. But this is really the key takeaway that I want you to remember as part of this. If you are working with some of the larger organizations and they start talking about enterprise scale, or they start talking about Azure Landing Zones, they start talking about the Cloud Adoption Framework, then really that methodology for moving workloads into the cloud is something that would be good for you to be aware of. Likewise, if they've already deployed something like the Azure Landing Zones over the top, then it means there's a set of policies which are going to apply to your workloads, which will be sitting, this will be fun to see if the laser works. I haven't got a laser. Which will be sitting in this area here. So this is really where your applications sit, over here. So everything that comes above that is really the guardrails in place. So what do we mean by that? It means there's a host of policies and RBAC assignments which will be inherited from the management groups above, which then may apply to your workloads. So it's good to understand some of that and make sure you understand that some of those is actually going to do some work for you. Sorry, apologies for that. We'll do some of the work for you, and it will also mean that there might be some controls and some constraints over how that works. Okay. Likewise, over on the left-hand side here, there's a lot of information that's been configured in terms of the identity, the organization, how new subscriptions get created, but also there's a number of services, shared services if you like, that sit within the platform area on the left-hand side within that. So in terms of some of the identity, some of the management and automatic diagnostic logging and other aspects, when it comes to monitoring at a base level, and some of the connectivity, particularly hybrid connectivity, going back into their on-premise states through ExpressRoute, through VPN gateways and so on, then it means that you've got some existing shared services to basically rely on, okay? And the way I like to think about this is if historically people just threw new cloud native applications into the cloud, and it's a bit like the Wild West and the first settlers moving across, think of this as being a new settlement which has already got sheriffs in place. It's already got somebody making sure the laws are being adhered to. It's got banking, it's got railway, it's got telegraph. Okay, so you've got some services that you should know about. You've got some services that you can leverage. Okay. All right, so that's the key part of it. For some of you, and I do work with service and ISVs, they actually are hosting their own environments, and they're hosting it in environments where they want to prove the compliance themselves. So they may well be deploying Azure landing zones as their overarching management, their shared services, so they can then deploy their application for different customers within that context and be able to prove to those customers they're meeting compliancy and they're adhering to that standard way of deployment. Okay. Let's just dive down into the area for where I said the applications go. So yours, normal ISV application, if it gets deployed into a customer environment, this is a key thing we'll talk about later, into a customer environment, would go into a landing zone, normally into its own subscription at that level. And then you can have your own services within that, and it may well connect into an existing connectivity hub. Your services may have their diagnostics automatically stored somewhere else. You'd automatically be able to leverage the identity that sits within those shared services. So these are some of the areas and how it allows you to leverage what you have there. But also, it gives you the ability to have services specific to your application still sitting within the landing zone. So a big part of how this works is the whole concept of delegation, so that actually provisioning into these environments is delegated out rather than being centrally controlled. So it actually frees you up to move a little bit faster. And also, it means that you can have direct access if it's not needed for private connectivity. So here we've got a link with the VNet peering, you'll see at the top, going for the virtual network for this application back into the connectivity hub, the subscription we have for that. That's fine if you need private access for that customer to go through privately across ExpressRoute or site to site to go into your application. But if it is a normal application where you've got all the authentication and everything is going through a public interface first, then you can go straight in to your application. So we've got services like App Gateway and others which then feed into that. Okay. The deck itself has got a whole host of links and materials which will be available afterwards. So if you want to start learning then going through some of those adoption processes for the assessments and getting the overview, we've got a good learning module. So if you want to go a little bit deeper in understanding how this all hangs together and what some of the terminology means, then it could be worth investing a little bit of time to do so. But we have got some recently released specific materials aimed at ISVs. So the link you see there, ak.ms/ALZ for Azure Landing Zones /ISV, will take you through to some specific recommendations for how you should basically work with customers' landing zones. So this is some useful information. And it will come through to separation, how it works, particularly when it comes to some of the identity side and how we work with directories and how that hangs together, but also how it looks in terms of making sure your application fits into the methodology, fits into the services we talked about in terms of identity, resource organization, connectivity. Okay. We'll touch on some of those subjects a little bit more when Luke in the session afterwards goes through some of the well architecture framework and how you can assess your applications, see how well they fit into that kind of framework. Here's some other examples of what comes into that ISV recommendations and some of the documentation. And frankly, having worked with partners over the last 6 years, I would say there's actually more different deployment models here, but this does fit a large number of customers. So whether or not you're hosting a SaaS application in your own subscriptions, in your own tenancy, if you've got something which is deploying direct into customer subscriptions, preferably transacting through our marketplace because there's benefits in doing so, or if it's a more hybrid model where you've got some pieces working multi-tenancy with access through, maybe you're hosting that, and then you're either deploying stuff per customer within your subscription or connecting through to something within their subscription. There's a number of different models. And we've got a lot of flexibility in how we can interlink things and provide managed services, which we'll touch on in this deck. One of the key options we've got down here, if you're hosting yourself, is whether or not you stick with one directory or you decide to split it. Okay, so if you've got, and it depends how you organize it, depends how you manage it, depends how you govern yourself in that context. So we have some organizations where they have everything hosted together, and effectively their corporate functions and what they're hosting SaaS-wise for their customers sits with the same identity backend directory facilitating that. Others have split it, so they keep the corporate function and the directory and identities in one place, and then they can maintain something separate to make sure they're isolating what they're doing for the SaaS hosting, because it's different teams doing different things and they're not administered in the same way. So that's a decision point to take. We'll very commonly see an option B coming through. Okay, right. I'm not going to talk through everything we have in Azure Networking because that will take way too long. What we'll do is touch on some of the key ones I've put in bold on here, which may be pertinent to how you get application delivery, how your customers get access into your applications when they're hosted in Azure, and also how you can interlink different systems and how you can manage them afterwards. So we'll go through some of that. One of the key new services we have is Azure Front Door. In fact, I'm not going to linger on this slide for too long because we've got a few more slides where we're going to dive into it a little bit deeper. But in terms of globally dealing with HTTP and HTTPS traffic, then version 2 of this service is fantastic. We've condensed a lot of the redirects and the routing, SSL termination. Latency-wise, it's amazing because it's right in all our points of presence and deals with that in terms of getting the most direct connectivity. And we've got a whole host of security, CDN, and redirect rules which are baked into it. So there's some good information on some of the sites we have around Azure Front Door v2. So if you haven't looked at that, you've been looking at some of the older technologies like our Azure CDN or Azure Traffic Manager services for global delivery, then take the time to have a look at Front Door. We'll dive into that a little bit later. When we get into region, so obviously the Front Door is our global solution. When you get into UK South, UK West, West Europe, wherever you happen to be, Application Gateway is one of the hero services we have for application delivery. So this is a layer 7 load balancer. And again, it can deal with different rules, deal with the HTTP and HTTPS traffic at that level, but it will deal with session affinity for your cookies. It will deal with security rules around OWASP and everything else when you bundle that in, when you take the WAF functionality. And it gives you a lot of capability to really leverage that front end for your scalable back end and systems. We can also bed in a web application file within that as well. So if you need to add some additional security with what you're doing with this, then actually you've got a choice at the moment. So with Azure Front Door, you can put a firewall within that or at this level as well. But again, there's a lot of functionality. You know, us as Microsoft, we have a huge investment and a huge team working on the security, and a lot of the AI and a lot of the expertise gets baked into the services we run, such as the web application firewall. When you're then diving into different environments, then if you want to go for something to segregate different tiers of your service or act as a front end and you just need layer 4 functionality, then the Azure Load Balancer is really where you want to be. Okay, so it's a far cheaper service for one reason. You can have a choice of public or private front-end IP addresses for that, and you've got some real flexibility in terms of the pooling behind that and how it works. And for those of you working in regions such as UK South, where we have 3 availability zones, you've got the ability to distribute your application across those to make sure that you can survive any data center failures or any power grid failures within the London area. Then the standard version of these kind of services will distribute across those. So you've got a front end, which then will be resilient to any failure at that level as well. So a lot of functionality within that. Deals with a lot of NAT rules as well, and you can dive through into individual instances if you configure it too. So a lot of functionality is there. The way it's shown here, because quite commonly you'll see App Gateway fronting something, and then something like Azure Load Balancer maybe in front of a scale set behind that. Here, the diagram is showing how you can scale your application. So if you've got a big application, which would be lovely to have on Azure, and you find that it's actually hitting some scaling limits within Application Gateway, then actually putting Azure Load Balancer in front of that enables you to scale out the instances, depending on how your application works. So that's what the diagram's showing. Okay. All right, Private Link. Hopefully some of you will be familiar with Private Link, but effectively, if you look at our PaaS services, then when you spin up something like an Azure database, SQL, Postgres, MySQL, whatever it happens to be, Key Vault, storage accounts, all these services are PaaS services, and when you spin up a PaaS service, you get a public FQDN to access that PaaS endpoint, okay? So there's security and controls we put around those in terms of firewalls, in terms of authentication, but a more common pattern we're seeing for a lot of the applications being deployed is that customers are asking for private connectivity throughout. if you're storing their data in a storage account that you're hosting, if you're storing their data in a SQL database at the back end, they want to be assured that the connectivity through to your application and then through to that storage is secured and it's not publicly available. So there's a couple of different options to secure that. One is to make use of our older, if you like, first take at how to handle this, and it's still a valid solution, which is Service Endpoint, which basically says that anything sitting in these particular virtual networks and subnets within Azure will go through a private SSL tunnel through to these kind of services, or you can take it a step further with Private Endpoint. So Private Endpoint allows you to then effectively have a private endpoint which then connects with a private IP address direct through to one specific instance of a database, one specific instance of a storage account. So you can get to the point, even if you've got a multi-tenanted application, where if your application knows which back-end system it needs to talk to, you can do so privately and securely and do it that way. Okay. And they're very flexible in the way they work. It does a lot of work with DNS to make that happen. So whilst it simplifies all of that and allows you to route, then there is some DNS complexity which gets added in. But if you're making use of Azure DNS, then it's all done magically for you. One thing you'll notice on the right-hand side there in the Azure Services box is we have both Azure PaaS, what I've been talking about so far, and also your own service. So we'll come back to this when we look at Private Link Service a little bit later on. Okay. Right, one of the unsung heroes of the networking one to be aware of is Azure NAT Gateway. So managed NAT for your egress traffic from any virtual networks. Why is this important? Because some of you, and you may have hit this, or maybe you'll hit this in the future if you're not aware of it, may suddenly see some NAT saturation, some SNAT saturation on your egress ports from certain systems. So if you're going from a virtual machine, if you're going through a load balancer, you're going out, you can hit some limits if you've got a huge amount of egress traffic from your application going out. Okay? One of the ways to get past that is to automatically associate NAT Gateway with your subnets. Then everything will go through that, and it's a much more scalable system in the way that it works. Okay, and the slides back. One of the other things it does is it allows you to associate a single IP or an IP prefix, which is 2, 4, 8, 16 prefixes, contiguous prefixes, which you can then give to your customers. So if they're asking for an allowed list of which particular IPs to come from Azure for your application, and you want to be able to give them that list, NAT Gateway will allow you to do that. Okay, so if you need to whitelist from that perspective, then that's the way to do so. Right, let's go back to Azure Front Door for a second. So as I said, Azure Front Door, rather than working with DNS, is working with HTTP and HTTPS in the way that you access it. This is us making available all the functionality we use for our front door systems for applications such as Xbox, for Bing, and other parts of the Microsoft network. So this is something we use ourselves for that volume of traffic. And it enables us to really get through to a number of things which are important for application delivery at that level. One is when you're dealing with content delivery, be it static or dynamically generated content through your applications, particularly when you're going to SPA type applications, that works really nicely. Likewise, if you're diving through into modern microservices and you need to be able to have a rule set in front of that to be able to have a standard way of accessing those, and it really works. And it's really, in terms of securing those global internet services, then this is a much more robust method than relying on DNS to do so. So again, if you could dive into how it's been architected and how the front end Microsoft Edge works, then it's fantastic the way it accesses it. This diagram here gives you some example of how it's handling some of the content delivery. So the rule sets we have within Azure Front Door allow you to, depending on the pathing, go through to cache static assets, to automatically, dynamically load with path-based load balancing through different parts. So you can really split your application to deal with what it needs to deal with to deliver the content you need to deliver as part of your applications. So there's a lot of richness in how it deals with that. And you'll notice we've got some private links on the right-hand side, as we mentioned. Again, got some examples about how it gets spun up. You've got a very simple way of deploying it, where it beds all this functionality in together, but there's also a lot of control in how you do it with the richness of the right-hand side, where you can do the full automation with that. And everything we have within Azure, if you've not worked the platform before, can be driven by the CLIs with the SDKs and all infrastructure as code. So if you need to spin this up using ARM or Bicep templates or Terraform, then you can do so too. Here's an example of the rule sets. So you can see there's some good complexity into and statements, if statements, and the rich system doing that. It can work on the FQDNs. It can work on the pathing within that. It's got a good set of logic to work with different headers and redirect rules and basically manipulating what you need to do, ports, paths, content-wise, as you go through the front door and hit the back-end systems that you need to do. So you can basically set up your back-end systems in the way they need to be, what they're hitting within the different Azure regions, and really configure this as being the layer to make it all work at the front end. Baked into it is a lot of security. So we've taken, this is a very new service for us. This came out 6 to 9 months ago, in that kind of time frame. So a lot of the expertise we have in terms of how we want to make sure we're protecting systems and getting through to that zero trust model and bedding in all the intelligence and experience we have with security into it comes into how we work and how we've configured this service in the first place. Some of that comes through into the different tiers, so you will see more functionality in the full tier. But one of the things that came through from those of you who looked at Azure Front Door V1, which is a very much older service, if you, again, first stab at this, is we've simplified the pricing quite considerably and we've reduced down the barriers to entry. So at the lowest level, even for those applications which don't have huge amounts of throughput, it still gives you that richness of functionality at a more approachable price point. Okay, let's go back to Azure Private Link. So if you remember, we had that Private Link picture where I talked about Azure PaaS and your own service. So a couple of key things with Azure Private Link is because you're not connecting networks together to give that access, it means it's basically jumping through a little tunnel to get from one thing to another, okay? One of the benefits from that is that you can do that between subscriptions, you can do that between tenants, and it then opens up a number of doors for how you then work. So there, quite commonly it gets used within the same subscription where your virtual machines or your Kubernetes systems or your app service or whatever is computing is then talking through to a back-end system and is talking through to a private link. But you can also do this between yourself and customers. Okay, so being able to leverage the access to a database or to a storage account between customers, there's a request and approval handshake process to make that happen. And you can also use it to front your own systems as well. So if you wanted to front your own application and provide your customers with a private endpoint to go straight through to the front end of your application, Private Link Service enables that. Okay, this is one of those underutilized features in Azure, but when it comes to delivery of ISV applications into customer accounts securely with a minimum of fuss, Private Link Service is great. Okay, all you need to do to make that work, is put a standard load balancer in front of your application and then put Private Link Service in front of that. So if you look at the Azure load balancer we mentioned earlier, if it's talking to virtual machines, Kubernetes, if it's talking to anything you're fronting at that level, because it's quite happy talking to IPs, groups of IPs, you can then attach the Private Link Service to the internal IP front end for that, and then you've got something that you can provision out. So when I talked about those PaaS services for Microsoft, effectively we've got Private Link Service at the front of those Azure storage databases. The databases, the key vaults and everything else we provide private links for. So if this is of interest, if you've got customers who want private connectivity, if you've had those terrible conversations about whether or not you want to connect your networks together and get into that whole mess, don't ever do that, by the way. Have a look at the Private Link Service because it will fix a lot of problems for you. Okay? And again, it's really easy to spin up. You've got that request process, and you can make it all nice and secure and private. A couple of key things around private endpoint is that it's a many-to-one. So if you've got a single Private Link Service for the front end of your application, you can attach multiple private endpoints to that. Okay, so if you've got a multi-tenanted application, it doesn't stop you from having a single front end for that and giving multiple customers access that way. All right, I work with a lot of customers, a lot of partners who provision into customer environments. And it's almost like they used to do it within colo site or on-prem, where they would deploy the application almost like a COTS type application, and then maybe there'd be a service a year, 2 years down the line to update that and upgrade it. Okay, but obviously we're trying to drive and work with a lot of partners who want to shift towards managed services and be able to offer their offerings out more at a PaaS/SaaS type level, depending on what the application is doing. And so being able to deliver a managed service into that is really key. some of them are very used to using configuration management hosts, jump hosts, whatever they're doing to get access into systems. If that is part of what you're doing and you're using public IPs for that, then make sure you're looking at the Azure Bastion service to be able to do that instead, because that will give you secure access for both RDP and SSH into a management host at that level without having any public IPs involved, with more secure authentication. And it's been recently upgraded over the last couple of years so that it works across things like VNet peering. It also works with the standard tools, so rather than going through the portal and having SSH or RDP within the portal, which is great in itself, you've now got the ability to use standard RDP tools on your desktop, or SSH tools, from Linux or from OpenSSH on Windows, which has been standard for a while now as well. So you can use that, and you can combine that with AAD authentication, and you can also tunnel through to different ports. So if you need to access a particular port, you've got something running on 443 on that host, and that's your web administration interface, you can punch through to that by using the tunneling feature through Azure Bastion 2. So you can achieve all of that to get access to manage the systems you need and have that starting point within a customer environment without connecting anything, without doing anything really complicated. It's a really neat and tidy way of coming through. But for most organizations, if they're providing a full managed service over the top of something, they probably need something a bit richer in how they're doing that. If you want to effectively deploy into multiple customer subscriptions, and more customers want the applications deployed into their subscriptions for two reasons. One, they want to keep ownership of their data. So if their data is sitting in their subscriptions, it's in their database, it's in their storage account, makes them feel a bit more comfortable. It makes it easier to get past on those security concerns. The other reason they want to do that, and this is really where we're going to come to the marketplace a little bit later on, is a lot of the biggest customers have enterprise agreements. And within those enterprise agreements, as part of the discounts they get for the level of commitment they have to Azure, they'll have a Microsoft Azure commitment within that, a MAC. And being able to use the marketplace and deploy your applications and the costs associated with those allows them to decrement that MAC. So if they've got a commitment to consume, that helps with that process. So you'll see more and more applications being delivered either purely as SaaS or delivered straight into something from Marketplace automatically deployed. That's definitely what we're seeing this year. If you want to provide a managed service over those applications when they've been provided into a customer account, you've really got two different options. One is to make use of something like Azure Lighthouse. Okay, and what Azure Lighthouse does is it creates a definition for what authorizations you would like to have, and then when they delegate a subscription or a set of resource groups, those resources are then projected through to your tenant with those particular approvals. So you can have a security group that's got contributor access on a particular subscription or resource group, which then means that when you go into the portal, you have a view where rather than just having the directory filter which says, I want to filter on these subscriptions, you can now filter on tenants and subscriptions. You can see a complete multi-tenanted view of all your customers at the same time. You can automate, you can report, you can monitor, you can get that visibility at that level. So if you want to centralize that, particularly for those of you who are working in secure environments and you want to get that security information, or maybe just taking the custom logs from your applications, you want to be alerted if there's an issue in different customers, this is a great way of getting to that point. Okay, well, I said that was one of the two ways. We'll come to the other one at the back end of this. Doing right for time. Right, let's just talk about the marketplace because I mentioned it briefly earlier. Marketplace is so important to us, and one of the reasons is we see it as a real accelerator to growth. When we work with different ISVs, when they go through the more difficult steps to get something into the marketplace, and it is more effort to get it into the marketplace, then if it's marketed right and it's the right kind of application and the demand is out there, we see some of these things really hockey stick up in terms of how much consumption it really drives. And the number of customers who are looking to consume through the marketplace and take it straight from the portal to deploy different applications is huge. So those who are winning this are winning big. Okay, and one of the reasons it's great for you guys is compared to other platforms, the actual transaction fee is pretty low and very flat across the board. So we're seeing a lot of customers make some good revenue targets at what they're seeing here. So much lower than standard. In terms of what we host within the marketplace, just be aware there's two different marketplaces. There's Azure Marketplace, which is really more for the products. There's a separate one called AppSource, which is more services based. So I'm going to concentrate on Marketplace as part of this conversation. When you have solutions in Marketplace, they come at these levels. So you can have something which is just a listing. Effectively, it's just something as a placeholder, which then gives you some contact me type information to come through to the right place. But really the place we're pushing towards is those where they've got the option to trial your software direct from the marketplace. You know, if they can dip their toe in the water, they know how much it's going to be. If they like it, they're much more likely to try it out in the first place rather than pick up the phone and call. Likewise, we have quite a few where the provisioning, the automation from it, is effectively allowing you to provision the Azure services, but then it's a separate conversation around whether or not they bring their licenses and put them onto anything that's running that system in a more old-fashioned way, if you like. But if that's something where the front-end application is dumbed down until you put those license keys on, and that's the way your application works, then that works fine. Or you can go for full transact, where actually not just the cost of the Azure services is passed through to the customer, but the value of your application and the business value that brings is reflected in the price that's shown in the plan and in the listing. And that's really where we're seeing a lot more partners who may have started their journey with Azure on the left-hand side really start saying, okay, we're getting some traction, but we want to get to that point and doing that. So that's a big focus for us this year. It's a big focus for the ISV partners that we're heavily engaged with as part of Global Partner Solutions. Now, we host a number of different offer types here. In fact, there's another one, managed service, which covers the Lighthouse side that we talked about earlier. But a few key ones. On the left-hand side, if you're just doing something which is fairly simple and you've customized one of our base platform images, you've taken Ubuntu or Windows Server 2022 and you've put your application onto it, you've locked it down, secured it, and it's doing what it needs to do, and you can spin that up as a virtual machine with your application running on it, then that comes into the virtual machine offer type. So that's one of the first things we did. We do a similar sort of thing for containers, by the way. So if you've got a specific container image that you want to leverage and transact through the platform, we can do that too. We then have Azure application offer types, which allows you a bit more flexibility in what gets deployed. We'll come back to that because there's a couple of different flavors. That's going to be the last slide we talk about. And then if you are hosting your applications, if you've got a SaaS offer which is hosted within your tenancy, within your subscriptions, and your customers come to that, even if you're stamping out elements of it per customer, then that falls into the SaaS offer type. So that's more webhook-based and API-based in the way that works. So we'll step through that. So these two get deployed into the customer environment. SaaS offer type would sit in your environment. Okay. So virtual machine offer type, it means that you get the opportunity to customize your virtual machine image. We have a virtual machine custom builder process, which is based on HashiCorp's Packer. Do a lot of stuff with Packer itself just to basically automate that. But however you're doing your custom image, even if you're just taking it from that base way, there's ways of basically imaging those and then providing those in that context. Usage-based pricing. So for those of you who've used Azure, you'll know that it's effectively based on the offer type, the type of OS, and the virtual machine SKU is how the costing is passed through. You get the same sort of functionality with your custom images here. So if you've got something which is customized there, you can pass it through that way. So you'll see that if you look at Ubuntu on the platform, you've got 1804 or 2004 on the platform, that will come with one price for a particular virtual machine size or SKU. If you've got something like Windows Server 2022, if you're not bringing licenses in with Azure Hybrid Benefit, then there's a higher price for that, which basically reflects the cost of the operating system. You can do the same sort of thing where you set your prices and what that uplift looks like. And again, these are deploying into customer subscriptions. So for particularly those customers who've got Macs, it's working that level, it just gets deployed in, you just see the revenue pass through. So that works quite nicely. But you need a generalized virtual machine image, so effectively assist prepping what you've got, or using something like Packer to automatically do that for you. Sorry, I took that away before you took the photo. In terms of the SaaS offer types, I'll just build that up quickly. Obviously, if you've got that hosted in your environment, then this allows you to do some of that onboarding. So you've already got the application deployed. This is really just making sure that when customers come through our marketplaces, it's working with your system. It's basically onboarding them into your platform. And if they leave the platform or stop playing, then we need to make sure we communicate with each other and make sure that happens correctly. And that's how this works. So you get a lot more flexibility in how the billing works with this. And there's a number of different models that falls into the billing with the SaaS offer types. It can be an automated or manual process. Obviously, we're pushing towards the automated side. But really, what we're talking about here is fronting your SaaS application. So rather than going through your websites, which they can still do, they can go through the marketplace with the landing page, use the webhooks to talk through to make sure it's then spinning stuff automatically and onboarding them for you. And likewise, there's the API integration, so that communication from your side back into Microsoft Azure, and from Azure back the other direction if they stop paying for the billing, works correctly, and everything passes through to their monthly Azure bill correctly. Okay, I mentioned about the Azure application type. I'm going to air some dirty laundry here. When you're doing this, you can deploy multiple resources. In fact, you can even include the resources for the Lighthouse definitions and assignments if you want to make use of those in there as well. But if you're deploying a more complex environment and you get everything working with ARM or Bicep and then translate those Bicep into ARM, you can then deploy that into a customer subscription. And that can include scripts, codes, assets, and everything else you put in that level. Okay, there's real flexibility of what you can do with that kind of automation. One of the things you need to do, though, if you want the billing to work with this, is embed a virtual machine image into it, because it basically rides on that and the pricing associated with it to make sure that the commercials work. It's a horrific kludge, sorry about that, but that's just the way that works. Okay, but it does allow you to have a lot more flexibility in terms of what you're deploying into a customer environment. Right. And I'm going to split those into two additional ones at this level as well. Okay, so in terms of the solution template plans, that's effectively what we just talked about in terms of deploying an ARM template into an environment. So that allows you to then deploy that application straight into there with everything around it. But it is effectively you're contributing that application into there, and then it's passing through those costs on a monthly basis. So the customer pays Azure resource costs and the virtual machine offer costs, which I talked about earlier. So that's how you embed that in. But I've aired a few of our sort of hidden secrets, which I think are really important to ISVs. You know, things like private link service, really the functionality with Azure Front Door and what that can do at that level. And one of the other ones that falls into that is managed applications. Okay, you'll see a few pages of this within our documentation, within our learn areas. But again, these are massively underutilized in terms of what they can do for certain application types. So if you want to deliver a SaaS solution, but it sits and resides in your customer subscriptions, but you want to be able to provide a managed service over the top of that, have a look at the managed applications. For those of you who've worked on the Azure platform for a little while, whenever you've deployed something like the Azure Kubernetes service, Databricks, Azure SQL Managed Instance, then you'll know that they spin up a single line item, a single resource in one of your resource groups, and then you get a separate system resource group with a host of things in there which you don't have access to, because that is a Microsoft managed application. So again, this is stuff that we use day in, day out, broadly across the scene. So we're deploying into customer subscriptions something which is managed by Microsoft. So taking that SQL managed instance, customer has limited access to that resource group because it's got deny assignments within that. And the Microsoft management team have the ability to use their automation. They get, again, that visibility essentially across the board for all the SQL managed instances. So when it comes to things like upgrades, management, monitoring, health, extensions, all those other things they do to make sure the service delivers the value that it needs to deliver for the customers, they're able to provide that as a PaaS platform. So if you're delivering PaaS or SaaS and you want to have that as something that you're able to manage, report on, and work with, upgrade automatically, then the managed applications are part of that. It really takes what you have with an ARM template and then adds on the additional authorizations for what is going to be, again, be projected back into your tenant with the permissions that you have within that. And then the third element that really falls into that is the UI definition. So there's a UI definition.json file, which basically then says what that experience looks like when you spin it up. So you'll have seen that when you think about how we used to do virtual machines and other things on the platform. You'd have that multi-step sequence where you select different things for it. And you can do the same sort of thing with a managed application, where you can get them to select different options, select where they want it to go, which subscription and so on, which region, and it deploys, but then it starts getting projected back and it does everything at that level. So again, it means that you're automatically getting those Azure resource costs, recurring usage, things that fall into that resource group, so as it expands out. It means that you can provide that as a managed service, so it's much more sticky, make sure you get the customers getting the benefit from it, you're seeing the utilization for it. And again, when it comes back to what I talked about with those enterprise agreements and with those MAC commitments and customers wanting to make use of marketplace deployable solutions to be able to decrement those, then again, it's another option which really helps to drive that. And if it's also factoring your managed service costs within the value of the solution, then it's good for them and it's good for you. Okay, so there are a few of the key things that I wanted to talk through today in terms of the cloud adoption framework, Azure Landing Zone, specifically what it means in terms of your awareness of what customers are doing to move onto the platform in the first instance, and how they're making sure they're protecting their services. You know, when they're taking that governance, they're taking the policy, how it applies to the workloads that sit underneath that, including your own. And then we've got these different mechanisms for then getting the application delivery. So in terms of how customers then connect through to those, hopefully some of those services we talked about give you some ideas about how to architect your solution and bring those together to make sure you're presenting the application the right way and giving them the access. Be it public through some of the functionality we talked about, or making use of something like a private link service. Okay, so again, or both. There's nothing stopping you from offering both at the same time. Likewise, if you've not looked into the marketplace and some of the benefits that's going to bring, if you start off at one level, it's quite common to do that with just getting the listing into the marketplace, getting your solution onto Azure and working at that level. But most partners that we're working with who've been working with Azure solutions for a while are drifting to the right-hand side of that slide we showed earlier around really making those solutions transactable. Okay, and we're definitely seeing a very much a split as to it tends to now be either complete SaaS hosted solution or something which is moving towards being transactable and deployable through the marketplace, one or the other. Okay, so hopefully that's giving you a good feel about where to head with some of the Microsoft technologies and how your application should fit into that kind of framework. Well, I think we'll wrap it up there then. Thank you very much for your attention. Appreciate that, and enjoy the rest of the day.